The name of George Takei, were many people known as one of the most famous Japanese-American actor globally. Still, many people didn't know that George Takei was the victims of the Japanese-American internment camps. To understand how the American government sends Mr. Takei and the 12,000 Japanese Americans to these concentration camps, we will talk about what caused it. The United States was the second largest Japanese diaspora globally behind Brazil. Most of the Japanese came to the United States after the end of the Boshin War. The Boshin Wars, or the Japanese Civil Wars, was the war between the Western-backed Japanese government and the Shogun government. Well, we will not cover this Boshin War because some of the YouTube Histories channel make video about this war. Back to the Japanese American. Most of the Japanese were settling in the west coast and the islands of Hawaii, primarily laborers expecting to work on the island's sugar plantations. Some 18,000 went to the west coast with establishing farm or small business. They were the three tribes of the Japanese American. Issei means people who born in Japan but immigrated to the United States. Nisei means Japanese American born in the United States or Canada, and Sansei mean children of the Japanese Americans. Before the Second World War, discrimination against Japanese American was existed, but it was not worse. Many white Americans who live in the West Coast resisted the arrivals of the ethnic group, fearing competitions from it and making the exaggerated claim that hordes of Asians were keen to take over white-owned farmland and businesses. Groups such as the Asiatic Exclusion League, the California Joint Immigration Commune, and the Native Son of the Golden Race organized in response to the rise of the Yellow Period. They successfully lobbied to restrict the Japanese immigration's property and citizenship rights, just as similar group has previously organized against Chinese immigrants. Following the Japanese invasions of China in 1931, many Japanese Americans were shocked that the American government would dehumanize the Japanese American and send them into the concentration camps. This, it will be happening 10 years later. On December 7, 1941, the world was shocked after Imperial Japanese Army attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. American public's opinion initially stood by the large populations of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, with the Los Angeles Times characterizing them as good Americans. Born and educated as such, many Americans believed that their loyalty to the United States was unquestionable. However, 6 weeks after the attack, public opinion along the Pacific began to turn against Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The press and other Americans became nervous about the potentials for Fifth Column's activity. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declared the agents to crack down against the Japanese American community and use violent interrogations against the Japanese American male. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declares Executive Order 9066. This executive order was very notorious. People with an enemy descent were suspected, including German Americans, Italian Americans, and Japanese Americans. Still, the worst is Japanese American, mean that Japanese Americans were undesirable to the American society. On March 2, 1942, General John DeVille, commanding generals of the Western Defense Command, publicly announced the creation of two restricted military zones. Military Area Number 1 consisted of the southern half of Arizona and the western halves of California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as all of California south of Los Angeles. Military Area Number 2 covered the rest of those states. The DeVille proclamations informed Japanese Americans they would be required to leave Military Area Number 1, but stated that they could remain in the second restricted zone. But let's talk about the conditions at the camp. The conditions at the camp were spare. Interns lived in the unrelated barrack, furnished only with cots and coal-burning stove. Residents used to share bathrooms and laundry facility, but hot water was usually limited. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fence patrolled by armed guards who had instruction to shoot anyone who tried to leave. Although a few isolated incidents of interns being shot and killed, and more numerous examples of preventable suffering. The camps generally were run humanely. And now, let's talk about how George Takei was sent to that camp. When he was 5 years old, his family was forced to live in the converted horse stable of Santa Anita Park before being sent to the Lower War Recollection Center for internment in Lower Arkansas. The internment camp was in swampland and surrounded by barbed wire fence. The family was later transferred to the two Lake War Recollection Centers in California for internment. If you want to know more about his early life, check his manga-influenced autobiography, They Call Us Enemy. They report that some of the camp guards shoot some of the Japanese Americans who tried to escape, and even notes that some camp guards committed a series of sexual assaults against Japanese American women. Food in these concentration camps was not worse, but it was minor. Many people live in the barracks-like conditions, standing in the long lines for little food, eating obscene pie plates in a big mess hall. They were fed government community food and castle of meat from army surplus, hot dogs, ketchups, kines, spams, and potatoes. The Japanese diets and family table were erased. However, some journalists investigated what happened in these camps, but it failed. Following Emperor Hirohito's surrender to the United States Army, many Japanese American concentration camps were closed, and many Japanese Americans were released from these camps. Many Japanese Americans couldn't find a job because many Americans saw that Japanese Americans were cockroaches, and some were becoming homeless. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act 1988, officially apologized for the internment on behalf of the U.S. government, and authorized a payment of $20,000 to each former internee who was still alive. When the act was passed, the legalization admitted that government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and failures of political leadership. The Japanese American internment camps was controversial in American politics. Even in the 21st century, the American government incarcerated Central American children like an animal, similar to the Japanese American internment camps during the Second World War. Many people refer that the internment of the Japanese American as one of the another war crimes that happened in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. And that's it the video. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to The Heart of Darkness. And if some part was inaccurate, I will apologize about that. And thank you for watching.